Karaksha folded her scaled arms across her chest, her golden eyes narrowing at the derelict structure before her. The building was a rusted monument to abandonment, sitting on the forgotten edge of Station Waypoint 7 like a tumor nobody bothered to remove. Debris floated lazily around its exterior, and entire sections of the outer hull were missing, exposing twisted metal beams that looked like the ribs of some long-dead creature. "This?" she asked, her reptilian voice dripping with disdain. "You want me to buy this?" Jake Morrison ran a calloused hand through his graying hair and grinned. The human mechanic looked every bit the part, oil-stained coveralls that had probably never been truly clean, scarred hands that told stories of 1,000 repairs, and that insufferable confidence that his species seemed to wear like a second skin. He stood there with his hands on his hips, staring at the wreck like it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Trust me, Carax. This is exactly what I need." The dragon woman let out a hiss of frustration. "Trust." Humans always asked for trust. She'd learned over the years that when a human asked you to trust them, you were about to do something incredibly stupid or incredibly profitable. Sometimes both. The dragon woman had employed Jake for 3 years now, ever since her family's prize fusion yacht started eating through mechanics like a black hole consumed stars. The ship was her father's pride and joy, a sleek vessel worth more than most planets' annual exports. Every alien engineer in 3 sectors had declared the temperamental drives impossible to maintain. They'd poked and prodded, run diagnostics, and ultimately thrown up their appendages in defeat. Then Jake had walked into her hangar on Draconis Prime, taken one look at the smoking engines while casually eating something called a sandwich, and had them purring like a content feline within a day. He'd barely even broken a sweat. When her father asked what the problem had been, Jake had shrugged and said the engines were lonely and needed someone who spoke their language. Her father had laughed so hard he'd nearly choked. Since then, Jake had become indispensable. Annoying, expensive, and absolutely indispensable. "You say you can build me a custom transport in 6 months, she said slowly, her tail swishing behind her in agitation. "Using this. I can. And you need me to purchase this garbage heap. Why?" "Because nobody else will sell it to a human," Jake replied, his smile fading just a bit. There was something in his eyes now, something serious. "And because I can't afford it myself. You know how it is, Carax. We humans don't exactly get the benefit of the doubt when it comes to buying old facilities. Too many questions. Too many regulations." Karaksha knew exactly what he meant. The Galactic Collective had rules upon rules about what humans could and couldn't purchase. Old industrial facilities were particularly restricted. Something about humanity's unfortunate tendency to turn anything with a power source into something far more interesting than it was originally intended to be. She studied the structure again, really looking at it this time. Even by human standards, it was ancient. Faded symbols covered the walls, old Earth languages that predated modern standard by centuries. Warning signs, long since weathered into illegibility, peppered the exterior. The whole thing should have been demolished decades ago. Maybe even a century ago. Yet here it sat, stubbornly refusing to fall apart completely. "How much?" she asked, already doing the mental calculations. If Jake could really build her a custom ship, it would be worth 10 times whatever this wreck cost. 12,000 credits. Station Authority just wants it off the books. It's been sitting here so long they've forgotten what it even was. They just see an eyesore taking up valuable real estate. It was nothing. Pocket change. A rounding error in her quarterly dividends. She'd spent more on a single dinner last week. Still, the dragon woman's business instincts prickled like scales standing on end. In her experience, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed, especially when humans were involved. "What's the catch?" she asked, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. Jake walked to the entrance, his boots crunching on debris that had accumulated over who knew how many years. His hand hovered over a control panel so rusted and corroded it looked more like abstract sculpture than functional technology. No catch. Just an old garage that nobody wants to remember. When his palm touched the panel, something impossible happened. The rust flaked away in a cascade of red powder, falling like strange snow to the ground below. Clean metal gleamed underneath, silver and bright as if it had been polished yesterday. A deep thrum resonated through the structure, a vibration so low Karaksha felt it in her bones rather than heard it. It was like the building itself was taking its first breath in centuries, like something vast and ancient was waking from a very long sleep. Lights flickered on inside, one by one, casting a soft blue glow that seemed to push back the darkness with gentle insistence. Karaksha's scales rippled with alarm, standing on end in the way they did when her instincts screamed danger. "What did you just?" Some places remember what they were built for, Jake said quietly, his eyes reflecting the soft blue glow now emanating from within the garage. There was reverence in his voice, the kind of tone people used when standing in ancient temples or at the graves of heroes. This is one of them. Against every instinct screaming in her mind, against every business lesson her father had ever taught her, against all common sense and rational thought, Carrick Shaw pulled out her credit chip and transferred the funds. She had a feeling she was going to regret this. Or maybe, just maybe, she was about to be part of something extraordinary. With humans it was always hard to tell which. The first week, Carrick Shaw convinced herself she'd made a sound investment. Jake worked with methodical efficiency, clearing out debris that had accumulated over decades. Old equipment, broken tools, piles of unidentifiable junk that had been sitting there so long it had practically fossilized. He moved through it all with the patience of someone who knew exactly what he was doing, sorting things into neat piles, salvage, scrap, and keep. The Dragon Woman stopped by daily, logging his progress in her personal files. She'd take notes on her datapad, watching him work, calculating costs and timelines. A custom transport ship, built to her exact specifications, for a fraction of what a proper shipyard would charge. The fact that he was working in a building older than some civilizations was merely eccentric. Humans were eccentric. Everyone knew that. This was fine. Everything was fine. Then the lights started coming on. Not all at once. That might have been easier to explain. Instead, they flickered to life in sections, one after another, like the building was waking up piece by piece. A corridor here. A chamber there. Always when Jake was nearby, always seeming to anticipate where he'd need to go next. "Jake," she said on the 8th day, staring at a corridor that definitely hadn't been illuminated before. The walls were lined with lights casting a warm, steady glow that had absolutely no business working in a facility that was supposed to be dead. Why is there power in sections that shouldn't have power? The mechanic looked up from where he was examining a wall panel, his face smudged with grease and something that might have been hydraulic fluid. He had that look humans got when they were concentrating, tongue poking slightly out of the corner of his mouth, eyes squinted. Emergency grid still functional. Building's got its own reactor. That's impossible. Carrick Shaw's tail lashed in agitation. The station authority said this structure was completely dead. No power. No systems. Nothing. That's why it was so cheap. They probably believed that, Jake said, not looking particularly concerned. His fingers danced across the panel, and it slid open with a smooth pneumatic hiss that sounded far too healthy for equipment that old. Behind it, circuits gleamed like they'd been maintained yesterday. But the shutdown protocols were designed by humans. We don't build things to die. We build them to sleep. Carrick Shaw felt a chill run down her spine despite the comfortable temperature. "You're being cryptic again." "Sorry." Jake offered that apologetic smile that never quite reached his eyes when he was talking about human engineering. "Let me show you something instead." He led her deeper into the structure, past the main bay she'd seen during the purchase. The corridor seemed to extend impossibly far, and she realized with growing unease that the building was far larger than the external dimensions suggested. Much larger. The kind of larger that should have been obvious from the outside but somehow wasn't. "How deep does this go?" she asked, her voice echoing strangely in the metal corridors. 6 levels. Maybe 7. I haven't found the bottom yet. Jake said it so casually, like discovering hidden levels in a supposedly abandoned garage was just another Tuesday. They descended via a cargo lift that rumbled to life at Jake's approach. The Dragon Woman noticed something that made her scales prickle with unease. The mechanic never actually pressed any buttons. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, while the lift seemed to know exactly where he wanted to go. The building was responding to him. Not to commands. Not to controls. To him. "Jake, this isn't normal," she said as the lift descended deeper and deeper. "No," he agreed. "It's not." The third sublevel opened into something that stole the breath from Carrick Shaw's lungs. It was a cathedral of industry. A temple to human ambition. Fabrication equipment stretched into the darkness as far as she could see. Massive assembly arms that could have lifted entire buildings, material processors the size of her family mansion, manufacturing stations that belonged in a full-scale military shipyard, not an abandoned garage on the edge of nowhere. Everything was still, silent, waiting. But it wasn't the stillness of death. It was the stillness of something holding its breath. "By the eldest flames," Carrick Shaw breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "What is this place?" Jake walked to a wall, his movements careful, almost reverent. He brushed away decades of dust from a metal plaque with his sleeve. The dragon woman approached, her translator struggling with the archaic English text etched into the metal. Armstrong Aldrin Shipworks established 2187 where humanity reached for the stars. This was humanity's first interstellar shipyard, Jake said softly, his hand resting on the plaque like he was touching something sacred. Before we had faster-than-light travel. Before we met the rest of the galaxy. Before we knew there was anyone else out there. This is where we built the generation ships. Carrick Shaw knew the history, every species in the collective did. It was taught in schools across 1,000 worlds as an example of either human determination or human insanity, depending on who was teaching. Humanity's first expansion across the stars had been accomplished through massive vessels that took decades or even centuries to reach their destinations. City-sized arcs carrying tens of thousands of colonists into the unknown void, with no guarantee they'd ever reach anything but empty space and death. I thought those were built on Earth, she said, her voice shaky. The first three were Columbia, Endeavour, and Discovery. But Earth's gravity well made it too expensive, too difficult. So they built this, a proper shipyard in space, where humanity's future would be forged without fighting against our own planet's pull. Jake's hand moved from the plaque to rest on a dormant assembly arm, his touch gentle, almost like he was petting a sleeping animal. 217 generation ships were built here over 83 years. Then humanity developed FTL, joined the galactic community, and places like this became obsolete. So they abandoned it. They mothballed it, Jake corrected, and there was an important distinction in his tone. There's a difference. Abandonment means you're done with something. Mothballing means you're putting it away until it's needed again. As if in response to his words, more lights flickered on throughout the massive chamber. One by one, section by section, the cathedral of industry began to wake. Dormant systems began running diagnostic checks, displaying readouts in ancient human script that scrolled across screens Carrick Shaw hadn't even realized were there. The air itself seemed to change, becoming charged with potential energy. Jake, she said carefully, watching lights bloom in the darkness like artificial stars. What have you woken up? The mechanic smiled, and for the first time, the dragon woman saw something in his eyes that made her understand why the other species in the galaxy both respected and feared humanity in equal measure. It wasn't cruelty or aggression. It was something far more dangerous. It was the absolute certainty that nothing was impossible if you just refused to give up. Don't worry, Carricks, he said, his voice echoing through the awakening shipyard. I'm only going to build you a ship. But this place? It's going to remember what that means. By the third week, Carrick Shaw wasn't the only one who'd noticed. The first visitor was an elderly human woman named Margaret, who'd traveled 3 systems to reach waypoint 7. She arrived on a passenger liner, carrying nothing but a small bag and a worn photo album. She found Jake in the main assembly bay, where the skeleton of the ship was beginning to take shape. Metal ribs curved upward like the bones of some great beast, and the air smelled of welding and hot metal. I heard someone open the old yard, Margaret said, her voice carrying the weight of years. She stood at the entrance, one hand gripping a walking stick, the other pressed against her chest like she was trying to hold her heart inside. Jake set down his tools, wiping his hands on a rag that was probably dirtier than his hands were. Word travels fast. Fast enough. The woman walked slowly through the bay, her wrinkled hand trailing along support beams and bulkheads. Her fingers moved with familiarity, touching welds and joints like she was greeting old friends. My grandfather worked here. He was part of the team that built the Mayflower too. The colony ship that settled New Boston? Jake asked, genuine interest lighting up his face. The same. Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. He used to tell me stories when I was little. Said this place had a soul, that every ship built here carried a piece of humanity's hope with it into the stars. He died before I was old enough to really understand what he meant. She paused, running her hand along a beam. I think I understand now. She turned to Jake, studying him with eyes that had seen a lot of life. What are you building? Transport ship. Custom job for a client. The old woman studied the emerging structure, her head tilting as she examined the support members, the hull configuration, the way the pieces were coming together. Then she shook her head slowly, a knowing smile crossing her weathered face. That's no transport. Those support members, that hull configuration, you're building something that can take a beating and keep flying. Something that won't quit no matter what the universe throws at it. Jake didn't deny it. He just smiled slightly and said, old habits. Margaret laughed, a sound that was half joy and half sob. My grandfather would have loved you. More humans came after that. Within days, word had spread through the human communities scattered across nearby systems. They arrived in ones and twos at first, then in groups. The station authorities didn't know what to make of it. Neither did Carrick Shaw. Tom Rivera showed up on the fourth week, a grizzled cargo hauler with cybernetic arms and a face like old leather. He brought stories of his great-grandmother riveting hull plates in this very bay, working 16-hour shifts because humanity's future depended on every weld being perfect. He walked through the facility with tears streaming down his face, touching equipment his ancestor had operated nearly 3 centuries ago. She used to say that every rivet was a promise, Tom said, his voice rough with emotion. A promise that the people on those ships would make it. That humanity wouldn't end. That we'd keep going no matter how long it took. There was Beverly Chin, whose family had lived on the station when the shipyard was still operational. She was in her 50s, a successful merchant trader, but she stood in that bay like a child visiting a cathedral. My great-great-grandmother was born here, she whispered. In the medical bay on level 5. First human born in this facility. There's a plaque somewhere with her name on it. Jake helped her find it. They spent an hour searching through dust and darkness until they located the small brass plate. Victoria Chin, first life born in the old yard, a symbol of humanity's future among the stars. Beverly broke down completely, and Margaret held her while she cried. More came. Engineers who'd heard the legends. Historians who'd studied the generation ship era. Descendants of the thousands who'd worked here during humanity's first desperate reach for the stars. Each visitor brought memories, stories passed down through generations. And with each memory, each story, the shipyard seemed to wake further. Carrick Shaw watched it all with growing unease. Assembly arms that should have required entire crews to operate were moving with just Jake's minimal input. He'd type a few commands and the massive machinery would spring to life, moving with precision that shouldn't have been possible for equipment so old. Fabricators produced components overnight that should have taken weeks, and they did it with an efficiency that made modern shipyards look lazy. The building wasn't just operational, it was eager. She could feel it in the way systems activated before Jake needed them, in the way the facility seemed to anticipate what would be required next. It was like the shipyard had been waiting for someone to give it purpose again. On the 25th day, Carrick Shaw stood in the observation deck, watching Jake work below. He was surrounded by a dozen humans now, all of them helping in small ways. They weren't trained shipbuilders, most of them. They were just people who wanted to be part of what was happening here. Margaret climbed the stairs to join her, moving slowly with her walking stick. You're wondering what you've started? The old woman said. It wasn't a question. I bought a garage, Carrick Shaw replied, her voice flat. I'm getting a resurrection. You're getting more than that. Margaret gazed down at Jake, at the ship taking shape, at all the humans working together. You're giving us back a piece of ourselves we thought was gone. Humans don't just build things to use them. We build things that mean something. That ship down there? It's not just metal and circuits. It's proof that we haven't forgotten who we are. Carrick Shaw's tail twitched nervously. The other species are getting nervous. I've had 3 inquiries from collective officials this week alone. Let them be nervous, Margaret said softly. Let them remember that humans build things to last. We always have. We always will. Below them, Jake fired up another fabricator, and the sound of humanity building echoed through the ancient shipyard like a heartbeat that had never really stopped. The ship was nearly complete when the collective inspector returned, this time with a delegation. Carrick Shaw saw them arrive on the station's main dock, a group that made even the most jaded traders stop and stare. 3 species were represented, each one a major power in the Galactic Collective. An insectoid hive representative, its chitinous body clicking and whirring with each movement. A crystalline luminar diplomat, its body made of living crystal that hummed with internal light. And an energy being from the Chorus Collective, floating in a containment field that barely held its form together. This wasn't a casual inspection. This was serious. They stood in the assembly bay, watching as the final hull plates were sealed into place. Jake was on the upper gantry, supervising the last welds. The ship hung in the construction cradle like a sleeping giant, all sleek lines and purposeful design. It was beautiful in the way that human engineering could be beautiful. Not flashy, not decorative, but honest in its function. It's beautiful, the luminar admitted, its crystalline structure refracting the work lights into rainbow patterns that danced across the walls. But it is also concerning. Carrick Shaw had expected this. She'd been preparing for it all week, running through arguments in her head, consulting with her legal advisors. She stood beside Jake, her posture deliberately neutral, trying to look like a merchant who'd simply commissioned a ship and gotten exactly what she paid for. Concerning how? The hive representative buzzed forward, its compound eyes reflecting hundreds of tiny images of the ship. Its translator rendered the clicks and chirps into flat, emotionless words. We have analyzed the vessel's specifications. The data is quite clear. This is not the transport ship you commissioned. It meets all my requirements, Karaksha countered, though she'd been thinking the same thing for days. The ship was bigger than she'd asked for. Stronger. More capable. Everything about it screamed excess, but in a way that felt somehow restrained, purposeful. It exceeds them, the energy being pulsed, its words resonating directly in everyone's minds rather than through air. The sensation was always unsettling, like thoughts that weren't quite your own. The armor is rated for combat zones. The power systems can support weapons arrays that aren't currently installed but could be added. The cargo bay is configured for rapid conversion to multiple purposes. The life support systems could sustain a crew 10 times the size you specified. This is a generation ship design philosophy applied to a modern vessel. Jake spoke for the first time since the delegation had arrived. He'd been quiet up on the gantry just watching and listening. Now he climbed down the ladder, his boots ringing on the metal rungs, and walked across the bay floor until he stood directly in front of the 3 alien representatives. "It's a ship that won't die," he said simply. All eyes turned to the human. Margaret and the other humans who'd been working on the project stopped what they were doing, sensing that something important was happening. The bay fell silent except for the hum of machinery and the occasional hiss of cooling metal. "That's what you don't understand," Jake continued, his voice carrying through the bay with quiet intensity. "When humans built the generation ships, we weren't thinking about war. We weren't thinking about conquest or power. We were thinking about survival. Pure, desperate survival." He walked toward the ship, gesturing at its hull, its systems, its very bones. "Those ships carried everything we had, children, elders, our entire genetic and cultural legacy. Every book we'd ever written. Every song we'd ever sung. Every stupid joke and family recipe and piece of wisdom we'd accumulated over thousands of years. All of it, packed into metal boxes and sent into the void with no guarantee of ever reaching anything but empty space and death." The hive representative's mandibles clicked nervously. "We are aware of the history. Then you know they had to be able to repair themselves when something broke and there was no dock for 1,000 light years," Jake interrupted, his voice rising with passion. "They had to manufacture parts when the originals wore out. They had to sustain life indefinitely because maybe, just maybe, the journey would take longer than planned. And yes, they had to defend against any threat, asteroids, radiation, spatial anomalies, and anything else the universe decided to throw at them. Not because we wanted weapons but because we might be the last humans in existence and we had to survive." Tom Rivera, the old cargo hauler, stepped forward from where he'd been watching. "My great-grandmother told stories about the construction. Every system had backups. Every backup had backups. They built things 3 times stronger than they needed because they couldn't afford to fail. That philosophy is dangerous in a galaxy with faster-than-light travel," the hive representative said, its voice taking on a harder edge. "With FTL, ships need not be self-sufficient. They can dock at stations. They can receive supplies and repairs. They need not be fortresses capable of independent operation for centuries." "Maybe," Jake acknowledged, nodding slowly. "But habits die hard. When a human builds a ship, we still build like it's the last ship we'll ever have. We build like we're alone in the dark with nothing but our tools and our will to survive. We can't help it. It's in our bones, in our blood. You can't ask a species that spent centuries building vessels to carry us into the unknown to suddenly start building things that break easy." The Luminar's light pulsed thoughtfully, colors shifting from blue to purple to something that didn't quite have a name in most languages. "You agreed to stop building such vessels when you joined the collective. Your species signed treaties." "We agreed to shut down the generation-era shipyards," Jake corrected, his voice firm but not aggressive. "And we did. This one's been dormant for 200 years. It woke up because it recognized me as human, and it understood what I was trying to do. I didn't violate any treaty. I didn't activate forbidden technology. I just built a ship the way my ancestors taught me, and the building remembered how to help." The maiden voyage of the Persistence was scheduled for dawn, station time. Karaksha stood on the bridge, running her clawed hands over controls that felt simultaneously alien and intuitive. Everything was in the wrong place by standard galactic design, yet somehow her hands knew where to go. The ship hummed around her, a deep vibration she could feel in her chest. Power flowed through systems that would have taken months to break in on a normal vessel, to calibrate and tune until they worked together properly. But this wasn't a normal vessel, and it had come alive the moment they'd fired up the main reactor. Jake had spent the past week teaching her every system, every backup, every redundancy built into the persistence. He'd walked her through it all with the patience of a teacher who actually cared that his student understood, not just memorized. The ship could manufacture its own replacement parts using the onboard fabricators, not just simple components but complex systems. It could process raw materials into fuel, breaking down asteroids or even space debris if necessary. It could sustain a crew on internal resources for years without resupply, recycling everything with an efficiency that bordered on miraculous. It was, as the collective inspector had noted with barely concealed alarm, a generation ship philosophy compressed into a vessel a tenth the size. Every lesson humanity had learned from those desperate early voyages had been poured into this ship's design. Nothing was single-purpose. Nothing was fragile. Nothing was allowed to be a critical failure point. It was also the most expensive transport in the sector, though Carrick Shaw had stopped thinking of it in those terms weeks ago. This wasn't a transport. This was a legacy built in metal and hope. She found Jake in the engineering bay, shutting down the shipyard systems one by one. The massive facility was slowly going dark, its brief awakening coming to an end. Lights flickered out in sections, assembly arms lowered themselves into rest positions, fabricators powered down with sighs that sounded almost mournful. The building was going back to sleep and it seemed reluctant to let go. "Will you really seal it again?" she asked, her voice echoing in the vast space. "I will," Jake confirmed, closing a final panel with a soft click. His hands lingered on the metal for a moment, like he was saying goodbye to an old friend. "This place has built its last ship with me. But it'll be here waiting?" "For who?" Carrick Shaw asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "For the next human who wanders by and happens to have the right biometrics?" Jake smiled, that knowing smile she'd come to recognize over the years. "For whoever needs it. Could be tomorrow. Could be another 200 years. Doesn't matter. This place has time. That's the thing about human engineering, we build for the long game. We build like we won't be around to fix things, so they'd better not break." Margaret appeared from one of the side corridors, moving slowly with her walking stick. She'd stayed for the entire build, watching every day, sometimes just sitting and remembering. "My grandfather used to say that the old yard had patience. That it could wait as long as it needed to because it understood its purpose." "What was its purpose?" Carrick Shaw asked. "To make sure humanity survived," Margaret replied simply. "That's what all of this was for. The ships, the engineering, the redundancies. We built like the universe was trying to kill us because, well, it was. And we refused to die." Tom Rivera was there too, along with Beverly Chen and a dozen other humans who'd become part of this strange project. They stood together in the dimming light, bearing witness to the shipyard's return to sleep. "You know what's funny?" Tom said, his cybernetic arms whirring softly as he gestured at the ship. "Every species we've met builds things to last until they break. They calculate lifespans and maintenance schedules and replacement dates. But humans? We build things to last forever and then we're surprised when they don't." Jake laughed at that, a genuine sound that echoed through the bay. "Fair point. We're terrible at accepting that things end." They all walked together to the main hangar, where the Persistence sat in its launch cradle, ready for its maiden voyage. The ship gleamed under the work lights, every surface perfect, every system tested and retested. It looked eager to fly if a ship could be eager. "What happens now?" Beverly asked. "The collective isn't happy. They've made that clear. They'll watch us more closely," Jake admitted. "They'll be nervous every time a human touches old equipment. But they won't stop us because we didn't actually break any rules. We just remembered how to build properly." Carrick Shaw boarded her new ship, settling into the captain's chair that Jake had custom-fitted for her physiology. It was comfortable in a way that surprised her. Humans weren't known for understanding alien comfort. Through the viewport, she could see Jake and the others standing in the shipyard entrance, hands raised in farewell. The Persistence lifted smoothly, its engines purring with a confidence that made modern ships sound like they were struggling. As they cleared the station, Carrick Shaw looked back at the ancient structure, now dark and silent once more. "Helm," she ordered her pilot, "set course for Draconis Prime. Let's show my father what his 12,000 credits bought." As the ship jumped to FTL, the dragon woman realized something that made her scales ripple with an emotion she couldn't quite name. She hadn't hired a mechanic. She'd employed a master shipwright, perhaps one of the last who understood the old ways. And in doing so she gained not just a ship, but a piece of humanity's legacy, the part that looked at the impossible and built something anyway. The part that never ever gave up. Somewhere behind them the old yard slept, dreaming of the next time it would be needed. And it would be needed. Humans always found a way to need the things they built to last forever. That was just who they were.